Hi, and welcome to Ladies of Another View on Back. We have a very special show today. We're doing an hour-long special on human trafficking in North Dakota.
And you wouldn't even think it's in North Dakota, but it's everywhere.
That's the point, and that's why we want to do this, is Mary and I want to shed a spotlight on what's going on, what we need to look for, and to help people not just understand it, but to understand what you should do if you see something that doesn't look quite right. So let me begin by introducing our guests. We have Emily Schwartz. She's the North Dakota Human Trafficking Task Force Director. And then we also have, that's Emily right here, and on the end, we have Melissa Kaiser, who's the North Dakota Human Trafficking Task Force Eastern Navigator.
Yes.
Welcome to the show.
Yeah, Thank
welcome,
you.
ladies.
Thank you for having us. We really appreciate the offer to be here.
Very much.
Amen.
Well, Emily, why don't we begin by you explaining what is human trafficking and what does the task force do?
Human trafficking really involves either sex or labor trafficking, and we look at elements of force, fraud, and coercion. And the task force is responsible for responding to any call from a medical provider, social services, law enforcement, a prosecutor's office who may have identified or suspects that trafficking might be a part of somebody's experience. And so our operational team is called in to support those providers and individuals who are working directly with the client.
So you mentioned a bunch of professionals that can report it, but can just an average layperson report something?
Absolutely. We have set up a tip line, and we'll have that available and up on the screen shortly. But there's a tip line that goes directly to the State and Local Intelligence Center. And so what happens is anyone can report in, and they can report anonymously as well. And all of those tips are then reviewed by our operational team on a monthly basis, if not more frequently if there's an urgent request that comes in. And we just look at, if there are commonalities there or themes in some of the tips that are coming in and respond to them.
Mm-hmm.
Let's take a look. We have a map, and you can explain is this where the task force is covering, or explain that to me.
So the task force operates statewide. So we have response teams in each of, where you see the red dots, each of those 9 multidisciplinary team communities. And so our operational team is spread out, Fargo, Bismarck, everywhere, like Dickinson. But these MDT communities have local individuals who have already been a part of teams like sexual assault response teams or children's advocacy centers who have a really high level of experience in working with individuals who have experienced trauma. And so we call on them to be the first responders on the scene, and then we support them in the work that they're doing. And so the communities that are outlined are typically the more resource-rich, the places that are already have shelter available, have really strong investigative supports, things like that. And so we rely heavily on our team members to be the first ones on the ground.
So then, Melissa, you're with the Eastern Task Force?
So what's unique about our task force is we're statewide. And a lot of other states have multiple coalitions or task forces, but we function and communicate as a full state, which is really impactful. And so my job specifically, I'm a part of the task force, but my position covers the eastern half of the state. So the communities basically east of Jamestown, all north to south is my coverage area of the work I do. Part of that work is to get those teams together, like Emily talked about, those multidisciplinary teams. I facilitate those meetings, continue to provide resources to those teams, and then they're who I call when I get a phone call about a suspected case. I go to those communities.
Can you give us some insight in how you operate? I mean, a little bit you've already talked about, you get phone calls, you get tips. But what does it look like, boots on the ground type work?
Yeah, I think I can speak just to kind of the structural part of that. And so our operational team that is responding to these first calls, that is comprised of the navigators. So we have 3 across the state, and you'll meet all of them today, which is wonderful. We have a labor trafficking specialist. We have survivors that we work with to make sure that our work is informed. We have Homeland Security agents, and we have agents from the Bureau of Criminal Investigation, our statewide policing agency. So those are the people that really provide technical assistance, are the first points of contact for cases, And then Melissa can tell you a little bit about what happens when that first call comes in.
Yeah, so part of my role on the East is anytime someone would suspect trafficking, unless it's an emergency where they call law enforcement, I would be that first point of contact. And so from there, it's gathering really the dynamics of the case. Typically what we see is youth who run away, who have been exploited or trafficked, people who have been exploited through labor or work that we work with, and then women who maybe present that looks like a domestic violence situation, but they're actually being trafficked or exploited. So I get those calls just asking kind of what next, right? And so my job is to pull those teams together to figure out what do we know about this case and who can work with this victim or potential victim, and then what services do they need from there. So then we would get together as a team and provide what we call wraparound services, which are very person-centered, trauma-informed. And with that, it's just, do they have medical care? Do they have housing? Do they need an interview with law enforcement? Do they need children's advocacy services? And so it's really getting the whole team together to figure out what is our next step in working with and responding to this victim. And then the other type of work we do as well is sometimes we outreach to victims, and we partner with our law enforcement partners, and then we would go outreach to them and offer on-site medical advocacy, get them connected with housing, provide them hygiene products, gift cards, and just someone to talk to open up about, you know, we accept you, we're not here to judge you, we want to offer you a way out if you would like to at this time or 10 years from now.
So do you guys see a pattern? I think when I think of our state, I think of the oil patch, and I think of sex trafficking, and then I think of the eastern side of the state where there's more labor issues. Is there a pattern either way, whether it's labor issues or sex trafficking?
I think it's interesting that you say that or bring that up, because when we first started in 2015, we were really thinking all the activity is going to be out in the West. You know, everything's going to be in the oil fields. And what we found is that Fargo is really a hot spot. Bismarck's the hot spot. And so we were surprised by that. But I would say in terms of patterns, we see a lot of activity obviously in our rural communities, but I think what we were more surprised by was how active trafficking is in our rural areas. And we didn't expect the level of volume. And you'll hear a second, you hear about what that looks like today too. It's just surprising.
Sure, sure. So we don't have a lot of time left, but if you want to tell our viewers, what would you tell them right now as far as reporting or what they should do if they see something unusual?
I would say always, if it's an emergency, if you see a violent act or something in progress, call 911. You want your local responders there immediately. If you suspect something or you're not sure or you want to remain anonymous, you can submit a tip through the SLIC tip line.
And let's put that slide up. I think we have that information, and then while you're talking, Emily, people can take a look and maybe write that down or take a picture of it with your phone.
Perfect, thank you. And this is, yes, available on our website as well. And then we also work with Polaris. If you are somebody who hears some information today or at another point and thinks, this sounds a lot like something I've experienced, please call Polaris, or you can contact us directly. They're a national network who run a hotline, and so they have people 24 hours a day who can take calls, and some people just want to talk, some people aren't ready to leave yet, but they're available or can connect to services in any state. And so we really encourage people to call if they feel like that might be something that they've experienced, or if it's a family member who has someone who's being trafficked and they need support, because I think that's also very critical.
Okay, we're going to have to go to break, but I want to make the point that people can make donations too, that you do rely on donations, that there's a lot of work that you rely on that isn't just state-funded or tax donations. So, okay, when we come back, we're going to talk more about human trafficking in North Dakota. Stay with us after this with Ladies of Another View on Bakken. Thank you for coming back. I want to welcome to the show Dr. Anna-Lena Lundy.
You got it.
I want to make sure I pronounced it correctly, and another member of the North Dakota Task Force. And your job is Western Navigator, and you're the Eastern Navigator, Melissa.
Yes.
So how is that different? You're just covering different parts of the state?
Exactly. So everything for me is west of Beulah. So north,
Okay.
south, and west.
Okay,
Yes.
so now we talked about Beulah West and Jamestown East. Who handles the center?
You will meet that central navigator here shortly.
Okay,
Got it.
right,
Okay.
coming up.
Because
We're
I
going to
saw
have
the
it all
map
covered.
in a
Yep,
quarter.
You will.
And we're going to talk about labor trafficking right now during this segment. And what is labor trafficking?
Well, in this section too, we wanted to cover a lot of the myths and facts about both sex and labor trafficking. So with labor trafficking, we see people forced or coerced into work that might not be from here. So they come over here legally thinking that they're here for a construction job or for school or for agricultural work, and then someone has over them what's called debt bondage. So maybe they say, oh, for your travels you owe us a really obscure amount of money in taking their paychecks, or saying you can't call your family, or you can't send money back to your family unless you do all of these things. And so they're being exploited through labor, and typically then have a lot of medical needs that come out of that. So it's not looking like, we see a lot of myths about labor, about people coming here illegally, or that it's a choice, and we're seeing it really, that coercion is a really big piece of the labor trafficking portion.
It looks like they try to bring them over here, but then once they're here, it's like, oh, by the way, I got you here, now you owe me.
Now you owe me, yeah.
Correct.
And promises of a greater life, as a foreign-born national. You will be able to make money here and send it back to your family. Just the false promises and the illusion that it wasn't that great where you were from, this is going to be better.
Yes.
But holding something over their head.
Right. And is that quite common then? It must be, if you guys have a task force for it.
Yes,
it
we
is
can't
actually.
keep up.
It's agricultural, it's healthcare. It can be in anything where it's a service industry. It could also be drug trafficking. So you don't think about that, but just selling drugs for other people. We see labor trafficking crossing over sometimes to sex trafficking as well.
And how do you get to the bottom of that? Because some people would think, oh, illegal aliens, oh, drug trade, but you don't realize these people might be trafficked. So how do you figure that out?
Other providers, I would say, right,
Yes,
Annalena?
we rely with our frontline providers, law enforcement, our regular, people within our community. Eyes, I'm a nurse, and I've been a nurse, and I will always be a nurse. So it's all about education and awareness, what to look for. It can be anyone. It doesn't, people look at this typical, what a trafficking person would look like, what a trafficker looks like. There's no portrait of what one would look like.
Yeah, and I think it's kind of eliminating that allure that, for one, people that are trafficked want to do this, that they are addicted to sex or want to have sex for money. When it comes to trafficking, there's again that force or coercion behind it, and also not seeing it as someone who's chained up or abducted. These individuals in North Dakota aren't being kidnapped and abducted. They're being groomed, they're being manipulated, they're being forced, or they're being tricked into feeling like there is no other option.
Yeah, we look at two segments of people. It's so their core needs need to be met. So how do I pay my rent? How do I get food on the table? How do I pay for my child's diaper, for example? And then that feeling of being loved. Maybe they come from a broken family, or they feel vulnerable. They become vulnerable that way. And so the trafficker takes advantage of that. Some core need isn't met, or that vulnerability of needing to love someone, to feel special, and then the false promises, the coercion and all that, and then that could lead to the exploitation or the trafficking of an individual.
I think in a lot of movies, and I know Hollywood gets it wrong all the time, or they exploit it even worse than it is, but you see there have been some documentaries where someone will fall in love with this beautiful young girl and then kind of grooms them, brings them in, then all of a sudden once he has her under his thumb, then all of a sudden, oh, by the way, now here are my friends, and you will have sex with my friends. And
we do see that dynamic here, and it's
control.
Not the power and control, and it's not always female victims and male traffickers. We see familial pimping, where family members traffic family members, which could be female victims, female offenders, or male victims, female offenders. So even kind of eliminating that trafficker needing to be a male and that victim needing to be a female. That's a lot of what our victims and clients and survivors we see, but certainly the dynamics don't stop there.
Yeah, it's all about power and control. If you get an opportunity to talk to a trafficker, or what we've seen in our experience, it's about the psychological piece. That's the hard part, is how can I exert my power and control over someone, saying you're beautiful, I'll provide for you, you'll do this for me, and whatnot. It's all this illusion of a greater life. They sell you the dream, basically.
Do you have a problem ever where you're trying to help this person, they're being trafficked, but they're afraid, and so they won't admit to it, and they're not going to even, so what do you do then?
almost every time that happens. And we understand that in those teams that Emily and I talked about, understand that and have the training for that, because the fear of going against their trafficker, especially if that is the person who meets their basic needs or who they love, or it's their family members. So it's a fear of the unknown and fear of what happens to this person or what happens to me. And also we live in a very victim blaming culture. You think about shame and assumptions being made. So when someone comes forward as a victim, typically we question them first before we look at them as someone who's deserving of help, especially when you have sex involved and someone who people think came here illegally. And so it's breaking that down instead of looking at them as someone who did something wrong and is at fault, of looking at them as a victim who deserves services. And so a lot of our time is spent helping people not feel that they have to feel shame about what's happened to them, and that fear of what will happen.
So true, and the guilt. And they don't see themselves as victims. That's the big thing. That's a big myth. They see themselves as criminals because, unfortunately, throughout their time, they may have been forced to do something against their will. So the trafficker will say, well, you committed a crime. Who's going to want to be with you? I'll take care of you instead. So it's a vicious cycle. It's a huge barrier. And also navigating who is that person I can trust and build rapport and share, because the goal is never disclosure. It's all about, when we train and we do a lot of education, it's like these victims need to find someone who they can talk to, they can trust, and it's up to them to leave the life, but at the same time, maybe they can't because they're so afraid of retaliation.
Yes.
All the things that she mentioned.
And Ann and Elena, you're a nurse. How did you get into this, and what kind of training did you need?
So I've been a nurse for a really long time, and I know that I've seen these victims throughout my entire career. I have 20-some years of experience. And I fell into this because I moved to North Dakota and saw that task force teams and multidisciplinary teams were needed, and they always look for a healthcare professional to be a part of it. So part of my nursing training is to look at victims of crime, victims of violence, and providing that wraparound support. It only made sense, sort of, to go into the trafficking and the labor part and the exploitation. I'm all about prevention, and we have to do a
Well, let's put
better
this up
job.
on the screen again, because I bet this was something that you relied on as a nurse when you started to become aware. You needed to know who to contact.
Right.
We have the website up there and the telephone number. If you go to the bottom to call for help, you can text, or the phone number, the 800 number, 737-7888. Any other advice to our viewers if they suspect something or what they need to do?
Being aware and calling someone, this is a great state. We have people who care, and calling and reporting, every tip will get investigated, which is what I love about our partners. There's never a bad tip.
Awesome.
Okay, perfect. Never a bad tip, remember that. And when we come back, we're going to talk more about human trafficking, so stick with us.
Yes,
with
thanks for
Ladies of
coming
Another
on,
View.
you guys.
Yes, thank
Really,
you.
really
you.
appreciate it.
Thank you.
We'll be right back after this. Welcome back to Ladies of Another View on Bakken, and we are continuing talking about human trafficking in North Dakota. And we have with us now Stacy Schaefer and Roddy Matsika. All right.
Yes, correct.
And they also are on the North Dakota Human Trafficking Task Force. And Stacy, you both deal with labor trafficking, correct?
Yes.
Tell us what that's about.
Yeah.
Well, we did talk about it a little bit, but in North Dakota, what are you
Sure.
seeing the most of?
Yes, so I think the reality when we talk about human trafficking, a lot of people just think sex trafficking. They forget that there's this whole other category known as labor trafficking. So I think part of that is sex trafficking has been glamorized so much over the years that we've literally just forgot that there's this other piece of labor trafficking existing. So what we often see in North Dakota is people that are brought into the state legally on some type of visa, whether it's an H-2A or H-2B visa. There's over 100 visa statuses though, so it might be a different one. And then once they get here, that's when the problems occur. So maybe wages are withheld, or they're forced to work long hours in very rough conditions. Those are the things that we see, but often people don't realize it's happening right in front of them.
Wow. So I think of, I know you guys are on the labor side, but they had mentioned agriculture as well as the oil patch. It could be even something over in the Fargo area, but explain to our viewers what you see the most of.
You know, what is interesting about labor trafficking is that it is embedded in the very fabric of our society. So it's difficult to discern or to detect. That's why we find it easier to find people who are in those settings like hoteliers, hospitality industry, and restaurants, because they interact with people. It's easier to detect those ones. So even if you look at the stats that we have, you'll find 22% of those labor trafficking victims we detected, they are from hospitality.
Hospitality.
Wow,
and we have
something to think about.
And we have this case 10 in restaurants. So it's because there is an interface with people. So naturally.
I have a couple graphics I want to take a look at and you can comment on, because the first one is going to make the comparison between male and female.
Yeah.
And these are, I should make the point that these are current statistics as of June of this year, 2021.
Yep. And as you can see, there is definitely more females that tend to be victims when it comes to labor trafficking, but males as well. So we can't forget that there are males that are victims of human trafficking as well. It's not just females, and I think we often associate that only females can be victims of human trafficking.
Sure, it seems like in the agriculture industry, a lot of people are coming from South Africa.
Yeah.
Is that a problem?
Well, see, people are brought in on visas
Right.
from all over, and that's the thing. It just is when they get here, what happens with that employer. So there's people from the Philippines, Honduras, South Africa, and I'm sure the list goes on. But it's essentially what happens once they get here. So that's the tricky part.
Right, right.
Yeah.
So,
Well, let's take a look at another slide because let's see, what do we have here? We have the type of work and also, well, the minor or adults. So you have 18% minors and 82% adults.
Yeah.
And so I think, is it easy to say, well, they're adults, they're not kids, we don't need to worry about them, they can take care of themselves?
Yeah, and the other thing me and Rati were talking about even earlier today is we don't think about the person fixing our roof or the construction company that we might see, that there's a possibility that labor trafficking could be happening within those companies. We don't think about that. We're more concerned is my roof getting fixed, right? And so that's part of the problem with labor trafficking too, is we just don't detect it because it can be right in front of us, but yet we don't see it. And it is often adults in these industries.
so I know that you mentioned it's in the hospitality and restaurant business. And the 1% is regarding the minors. Are they children of the adults that are being trafficked? Is it like a family being trafficked, or are they individuals that have come up separately?
That is very tricky because naturally we cannot tell where this person is coming from. What we normally detect easily is a child of a victim of trafficking is usually also a victim of trafficking. So naturally it goes like that in terms of labor trafficking. And labor trafficking can also be child labor trafficking. That's why it's easier for us to...
Oh, easier for child labor trafficking than adults.
Yes, we can delineate that to say this is child labor trafficking, but it's still labor trafficking.
Right.
It depends on the age. So when we look at those statistics, we say this 18% or this huge percentage of adults is because adults are easier to interact with.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
Well, let's take a look at the type of trafficking you see, what kind of labor they are doing. This is here in North Dakota. So you do see a lot. Look at the bottom there, 22% in hospitality. After that, you have the restaurant and food service. So are they working, what, as dishwashers maybe?
Yeah, they could even be servers at the restaurant too. I think part of it as well is oftentimes some employers might have been raised in a situation of, we have brought other people here to help us before, and this is how they, like my dad treated them. So then I assume that that's okay. So some of it is a lack of awareness by employers of how to actually treat employees as well. So we do see that too, where there's just that disconnect of what are our rights as employees? And sometimes employers don't always recognize that.
Right, and if they're from another country, they might not know that there are ways to report it. They
Exactly.
don't know the steps to go ahead and report something that is wrong.
Right. Yep. Like if I'm new to, no matter where you go, if you travel, when you're new somewhere, it's not like you know everything that's going on in that country. So whoever tells you the information, you're going to trust them and believe that that's true. And that's part of the problem with labor trafficking is whatever that employer is telling that employee, they deem as correct, even if it's not correct. So then finding the help. And then part of the problem too is some of these individuals might not speak the language. They might not be able to read. So many barriers. So then how do you find that help? So it's very difficult. We find these cases to be very difficult. Yeah.
Sure. Well, I guess that would be to have a language
Right,
barrier.
yes.
You know, say you're in the hotel industry, because you can go in a hotel and you can kind of see the sadness on people's faces.
Yep.
You can just see it, and you just wonder why or how they got there, and they don't speak English. And so now it makes me even second guess some of my stays, my recent stays.
Right, and we have worked with clients, obviously from that graph you can tell that we're in the hospitality industry, that we're working even in the breakfast area or cleaning the rooms, and we just don't recognize that. So I would encourage people, if somebody does seem like they're constantly being watched in a working environment, that they seem anxious when a certain person's around, they don't even want to make eye contact because they're worried what might happen. These are just clues that something might be happening in those situations and should give us that instinct that we should report it.
You know, one thing that might help, this just popped into my head, is to almost have a card like you can send out to different businesses or individuals. And so say you are a traveler, and it's like you can just pass somebody a card. If you need help, call this number,
Yeah.
that type of thing. But then I would think too, if someone is being trafficked, then maybe they might use that same card. So maybe that's not a great idea. You know what I'm saying? It's like, you know, I will help you, and then they get into a worse situation. It's just, I would say it's really hard to help these people.
Yeah, like you're saying, there is no single way of trying to detect these people, helping them. That is another way of doing it, but it needs other people to do certain things. That's why I find everybody needs to be on the deck to fight labor trafficking. You call that route, I go with another route, an aircraft attendant takes another route. Someone is checking in. They see someone is always buying tickets using cash. They become suspicious. Or somebody is being followed to the bathroom or wherever. You become suspicious. So it's very important to have all people really being educated about those indicators.
Wow. Well, thanks for all of that. Last words?
Yeah, and I would just say, you know, to go back to what you were saying, even with a card, you know, if you are able to get that person alone and able to just ask, how are you okay? That can just sometimes be an indicator. They might shake their head no.
Sure.
That gives us that knowledge. So we just really want people to know that labor trafficking is here, as well as sex trafficking, and we're just hoping to raise more
And
awareness.
to be aware, yeah. I think I've learned a lot just from listening and seeing what to look for and all the different industries they're in. So thank you, Rowdy and Stephanie, for coming in today. And thank you for the work that you're doing.
Amen to that.
And we'll be right back with more with Ladies of Another Few on Beck. Welcome back to Ladies of Another View on Back, and we are once again talking about human trafficking in North Dakota. And for this segment, we're going to talk about what it looks like in the rural parts of the state. So we have with us once again Anna Lena and also Sergeant Detective Danielle Hendricks. And you work out in the Williston area, correct?
Yes, correct.
All right, so help us understand what's going on in the rural areas, because we tend to think it's more of a big city crime.
Yeah, I think that's a really big misconception is that it only happens in the big cities or, you know, the suburbs or things like that. And definitely through, you know, our cases we've worked, obviously that's not the case. We have worked cases together in Williston, you know, in some of our smaller communities throughout the state as well.
So identifying them has been more of a challenge because of in our rural areas we have lack of resources. Sometimes we don't have enough manpower. So it's a perfect region or area for traffickers to go out because they know that. And so we've done a really great job with our Western partners, our rural partners, in awareness and education and who to report to and getting technical assistance from the task force as well.
So I understand that North Dakota has an issue during hunting season. Is that a fact or a myth?
You're the law enforcement person. Can we talk about it?
I would say that, I mean, maybe it would play a part.
Any kind of arena that there's a lot of people. So if you think about state fairs, rodeos, hunting season, sturgis, any of those big where there's a lot of people, those are areas that are potential for predators or traffickers to do their homework and look and see if there's anybody vulnerable available. What we see a lot is also in the rural areas is commercial sexual exploitation, internet crime, crime on the internet. The internet is a big issue for us, and is what we're seeing more and more, especially with the arena that we're in right now with the pandemic and
When you
COVID.
say internet crime, what is that? What happens?
Partner.
So essentially what we're seeing right now is primarily, specifically youth are being targeted and solicited via Snapchat, Instagram, Facebook, Discord, any social media app that's out there right now. Unfortunately, we're seeing children being targeted and solicited through those. Simple as online gaming systems where kids think they're playing with just their friends. Perpetrators can make their way into those chat rooms and, entice and solicit those children.
And we see it with our adults too, with our vulnerable adults in those sweetheart scams, catfishing and whatnot, So the internet has been a lot what we're seeing because people are lonely and it's very isolating out in the rural areas. And we put everything out on the internet.
Yes.
Well, I have, let's take a look. This is a graphic about the Bakken survivors of human trafficking.
Yep.
So you've got mostly adults.
60% adults and 40% minors.
Yep. And this is since the inception of the task force up until June. And I will be very curious to see after this year is over if those numbers will flip or change, because we're seeing a lot more of our youth, as Danielle was saying, exposed.
Okay,
as well.
so something, because I have kids that are just out of high school, but I've always been worried about different events that I take them to, whether it's rodeo, state fair. You mentioned both of those. And it's like, so you're not saying that the crime goes on there, but you're saying predators are at those events trying to find young people to solicit? Is that what you're saying?
I think to clarify, they're making themselves available at those events, not saying that they're always going to be out there soliciting, looking for the child that's walking, 10 feet away from mom.
Right.
Going out there to see those, I would call them a high-risk population. The children that are there unattended with no parents, they're watching their behaviors, they're seeing who their friends are, if they're isolated, is it a big group setting? Are they distracted by being on their cell phone? There's lots of different things that they're looking for that's going to make them easy to groom and start that process.
And also, I'll go back to the internet, hashtag I'm at the state fair.
Oh,
boy,
So we need to look at how we educate our youth and even our young adults on what you're putting out there, because that's geotagging. That's, I'm here, I'm by myself, I've had a bad day, hashtag I'm at the state fair.
Yep.
So things like that,
right. Those are just things that you don't even think of.
Nope.
It's all just very innocent, but that's
Very
what
much
people
so.
are
Very much so.
being a
Yes.
predator
Well,
for.
Let's take a look quickly and see how in North Dakota, how all these different agencies come together to serve. There's a lot of,
Yeah.
that's a big pie with a lot of pieces. That's
Yeah.
good to know.
Yeah, we're very fortunate. I love the state of North Dakota in that we do, even in our rural communities, wrap ourselves around. And this just clearly shows how we are actually, our eyes are open. So we're going to refer them. We know who our resources are. So from law enforcement to juvenile court to healthcare providers, it's being reported. So that's good.
And that's wonderful because you're all working together, because from what we've learned is it's very tricky. It's not obvious,
Very much.
not easy to get to them. And one more slide I want to show you is where some of the settings, that we were talking about that a little bit, where the human trafficking is occurring. And it's a little bit small for me to see, I'm sorry. But so you said things like the state fair.
Hotels, motels, in-home, we see that. The internet, restaurants.
Yep. And hotels and motels and homes, it's because it's behind closed doors. So the fact that it's being reported is good, but it's happening behind closed doors. So sometimes, we wonder how much more of that is happening. And again, the internet, it's a great tool, but at the same time, it opens up things up for this to happen or occur as well.
Now, Anna-Lena, you are, during the break you said you were from the DC area, is basically where you grew up, and we're like, DC is bigger than our state population as far as that goes. But would you say we are basically the same as far as the percentage? It doesn't matter if you're from a small community or a large community, it is everywhere.
It is everywhere. It's surprising to me because North Dakota, when people think of North Dakota, they think farming, they think rural, they think it's quiet. No, it's a perfect opportunity. No state is immune anymore, unfortunately. The internet has propagated that as well. And so, yeah, there's no perfect state, but North Dakota does a very good job at recognizing and working with our partners and wrapping ourselves around an identified victim. And opportunities like this to get the word out is even best too.
Do you sometimes see kids that came from good homes? So you would think, oh, those kind of kids aren't gonna. So yeah, you're both shaking your head. Tell me about it.
You know, there's no prime victim, I guess is what I want to say. I want to say when we look at cases, we talk about high-risk populations. However, it could be the child that comes from a loving home, two very involved parents. It just starts with that grooming process and, you know, just slowly isolating them and taking them, you know, away from that grip of their family life. But what I would say, see a little bit more of is that high-risk population of like runaways. So when we as law enforcement get assigned an investigation of a runaway, obviously questions need to be answered of how are they surviving right now? How are they eating? How are they having a roof over their head? How are their needs being met right now? And unfortunately, we do see cases where traffickers will grab a hold of those needs that need to be met and use that for their gain. To basically get that victim to where they need, or they want that victim to be at, as far as the trafficking goes.
And every human being wants to be loved and wants to belong. And so if we put it out there, if somebody takes advantage of that, it's very easy, as Danielle said, to lure, to groom, and then eventually get under their control, for lack of a better term. So yeah, everyone is vulnerable. Anyone is vulnerable, actually. From young to old.
Right. So yeah, don't take anything for granted. Don't make any assumptions, and just be alert.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming here and letting us know the kind of things we need to look for, and be in touch too.
Yes, thanks so much for coming on.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.